I'm Jeanette Keynes from Jewelry Arts Inc. In this video, I'm going to show you something a little bit tricky, how to solder a jump ring right up against granulation. Now, normally I like to do this with a little back sheet, but sometimes fuckery happens and we don't have any. So I'm going to show you how we deal with that, and incidentally, a little bit about the differences between ochre and ochre. Here's the situation. We have this sexy, beautiful, gorgeous setting here, granulation, lovely, lovely. And this cute little jump ring needs to go on there, and then the bail will go through that. So normally in a case like this with granulation, it's not really great to solder the jump ring absolutely to the granules, because then the solder wants to just run inside all the granules. So usually we leave a little back sheet there and solder it to the back sheet, and it just kind of helps us control it. However, sometimes in the dark night of the soul, we get tempted and we just cut away our back sheet when it is contraindicated. And we were also talking about how, like, the most common thing people always want to do is go ahead and cut their back sheet because it seems like a simple step. And a lot of times that actually causes issues. Like, for example, like someone's doing a pendant and they're like, oh, let me cut my back sheet out. And I'm like, but have you made all your components yet? Have you made all your wires? If you haven't made everything, you don't know how fucking big it needs to be, don't cut anything. And in this case, we were lulled into a false sense of security because we weren't remembering that the way that this stone is cut has an apex that has to fit at the exact right spot on here. So we saved some back sheet somewhere else, thinking like, oh, that'll work great. And then, So always remember, fuckery is the norm. And if you can avoid it, don't go ahead and cut, because it's so often that you go back and then go, oh, fuck me. Now, all of that being said, this is no terrible tragedy. We're just going to have to do it quite carefully. So that led us to masking mud versus ochre versus no cur, no flow. And then that's how we then devolved into the vegetable ochre. Just so you know the full story of how we got here, right? So you can use masking mud, which is also some kind of clay. It's dirt, you know. You've got ochre, which is a clay-based soil. You know, that's why it makes such a great pigment in painting, because it will never ever come off. Good, but problematic. And things like there's no flow, and we make nocre, and those are all usually some sort of like chalk-based stuff. They work well, but not as strong as like the ochre or the
masking mud.
The masking mud. See, if I didn't have my friends here with me, what would I do? Now, another thing that we were talking about with the masking mud works super well, right? But if you use enough of it on granules and you heat it enough, it basically forms a clay pot. And I have, asked me how I know. So we're gonna go with ochre instead. We have to be very careful about how we apply it, but that's what led to this long and very convoluted conversation.
Illuminating.
Yes, illuminating, thank you. See, I'll give her a 5 when it's over, you know what I mean? But that's how we go ahead and, that's how I make decisions. You're always going like, okay, what are the pros, what are the cons, and then what do I think like the safest way to do it that's gonna give us a good result? Because the fact of the matter is, sometimes when you're soldering, you can't deal with your issues with like a heat sink or with whatever. Sometimes you have to use like a nocre or a clay pot, or, you know what I mean, ochre. Honestly, if you took a vegetable and rubbed it on there, it would burn and probably would kind of do the same thing. We're gonna have to do a test of that in the studio. But, so, what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna add a little water to my ochre. And this is also a reminder for all of you out there, they sell ochre in like giant tubs, which is enough for you and every goldsmith that will ever exist till the end of time. So if you're gonna buy one of those, like just tell all your friends, I'll give you a teaspoon, and like you will all have ochre forever. So we just usually put it in some kind of janky little container. It dries out. I'm gonna add a little water to it. I usually try to work with it in sort of a sour cream consistency, because if it gets too thin and runny, it's just gonna run everywhere. And that's the whole tricky thing. It works so well that you can't, oops, I got some of it in my solder seam, because it will not flow. So I'm gonna put some water in here. I usually use this high-tech method like that. And if we haven't covered it already, this stuff is like herpes. Wherever it goes, it is incredibly hard to remove. So I always use like a fresh toothpick and then throw it in the garbage. If I get any on my hands, I immediately go and wash. This is not the kind of thing you can like get all over your bench and your hands and then touch everything. And then guess what? Everything's got herpes, okay? And then eventually when you're trying to granulate or fuse or whatever you're trying to do, you'll have major problems. So you never want to take a brush. That's why like people be like, oh, I use my brush. I'm like, are you ever gonna use that brush for anything else ever? Something disposable. Okay, so there's my PSA about all the deadly dangers of this. So we've already marked the corner that we're gonna work in right there, like so. So I'm gonna dip in a tiny little bit of this. Yeah, you do. Don't worry, we'll double check everything. So you see how I'm applying kind of small amounts and in there, and then I'm gonna dry it with a torch. Because all I'm trying to make sure, like obviously I need the solder to run onto the side of the granule a little bit, but we can't let it flow inside the granules and spread all over the place, because that, after all of our gorgeous granulation work, that would suck a lot. And you might be asking yourself, well then what the fuck does remove this? Paste flux. Put paste flux on it, you heat it up, and you pickle it. You may have to do that 2 or 3 times, but it will get the ochre out. That will not work on the masking mud, which works amazingly on a lot of things, but I think it's a little bit contraindicated with granules. It just, as I learned, much to my chagrin. Okay, so like I'll let you do a little close-up of that if you want. So it's not an enormous amount, and I'm gonna take the torch and I'm gonna carefully dry it, and then I'm gonna set up to solder, and we'll do another close-up of that. And when it's dry, it'll get sort of like dark brown or black. You see what I mean? Like that. Now that should be enough to do everything that I want to do. If anywhere in the process, you know, I feel like, oh shit, some paste flux has removed it, I'll reapply a little bit. But you know, usually that's what I do, like that, very carefully. I'm gonna set up everything and then we'll take a look at it. So all I've done here is I drew a nice straight line, as I do on the soldering board, so I can see what the fuck I'm doing, because you know, getting things straight is extremely difficult if you don't have something straight to look at. So I usually just do something like that. I've looked at it over the top, everything looks good, so then I'm gonna like cut up some little balls of solder and get them ready, and then we'll solder. So the big risky thing now is if I slather this now with some paste flux, right, as one does, and heat it up, guess what's gonna happen to all my carefully dried ochre? It's gonna flow everywhere. And then you have to clean everything immaculately and start over. So how am I going to deal with this? Well, what I'm going to do is I'm going to heat the piece up a tiny bit, so it's a tiny bit warm. I'm going to take the very end of my Jewelry Arts brand tweezers, and I'm just going to touch one little bit of paste flux right in the seam. I'm a big paste flux fan. I know it's the least healthy. That's because it works the best. Life is full of shit like that. Just like fried food tastes better than all other foods. The end. But that's what I'm gonna do, is because it's very concentrated, I can apply a very small amount just right where I need it. And then I'm gonna take my ridiculously adorable little solder balls over here, if you haven't seen. You see how cute they are? And I'm gonna put one, yeah, can you even see that little thing? Imagine that there is a tiny grain of sand, and that is solder. This is 18 karat soft. And I'm gonna put one there, and I'm gonna flow it. And basically, I'm gonna keep adding to that seam until it's filled. Sometimes you put one little piece and it's filled and great. Other times you're gonna do more than one. But the area itself is so small, you can't take like 2 or 3 pieces of solder and shove it in there. There's only room for one. So I'm gonna add one at a time, okay? And once I have it in the right place, I'll move aside a little bit so that you can get a close-up of it. Because it basically has to be touching Okay, I'm gonna move out of the way so that you can get a close-up of that, if you can see that ridiculously tiny little ball of solder. Okay, I'm gonna put another piece in there. I think maybe I have a connection. And I mean, this is why we normally leave the little back sheet there, because it makes it much less fussy. It's not the end of the world, but it's a pain in the ass. I mean, you know. See, jewelry being a pain in the ass can never equal the pure serotonin rush of when something actually goes where you fucking want it to go. So I'm gonna let Alexis do a little close-up of that, and then we'll do the same thing to the other side. Now the first side also is always the hardest one because it can move around.
Right.
Once you have the first side, yeah, exactly.
Right.
Once you have the first side done, the other side is actually,
behaves.
you know, behaves pretty easily. And yes, that's why we suffer, for the payoff. All right, so you see that. Look how sexy that looks. Oh, too beautiful. I love it. Oh my God. Okay, so now we're gonna put in our bail, and then we'll start cleaning all the ochre off, because we may as well just leave it dirty, because we're not gonna be soldering in that same spot anyway, so there's really no point in bothering to get it clean just yet.